let's get the show on the proverbial road. Today's lecture is about the power of religion in many ways. And we'll look at two episodes in English history. The attempted invasion by Spain in 1588 and the attempted terrorist attack on the House of Parliament and King James I in 1605. Both of these and their results will have far-reaching effects on the English mentality, on their understanding of the universe, an understanding that posits that God has chosen England, God has chosen Protestantism, and cast aside Catholicism. And both of these events will make Catholicism a dirty word in England. It will really seal the fate of the remaining Catholics in England, so that by the end of the 17th century, less than 2% of the population in England is Catholic, and most of those Catholics live in the north, especially in the county of Lancashire. We begin today with the global superpower of the 16th century. Spain controls everything that's red on this map. Everything that is in the pink color is controlled by Portugal, and after 1560, the King of Spain is also the King of Portugal. And so Philip II, who we met in the genealogy from the last class, controls an empire that is truly global, fabulously wealthy. Recall that he, in the 1550s, got married to one of Henry VIII's daughters, Mary Tudor. That he is the son of the Emperor Charles V, and that his House of Habsburg, you refer back to the genealogy, has close ties through Catherine of Aragon to the House of Tudor. But those close ties have frayed by the second half of the 16th century under the weight of the religious question. England and Elizabeth are Protestant. Philip is decidedly Catholic. And his faith is reflected in many ways in his modest house that he builds outside of Spain, El Escorial. Largest building in the world at the time, and the largest building for quite some time. It is a testament, on the one hand, to Spain's power, but also to his religiosity. If we look at it in an aerial satellite photograph, you can see it's a very distinctive grid design. Now, it's a matter of debate. Some scholars think it's so, and some scholars think it's not. I tend to think that this design is not accidental, but rather is an homage to Philip's favorite saint, St. Lawrence, or San Lorenzo, who was martyred during the Roman Empire by being grilled alive. Thus, the shape of the building is a griddle. Some scholars think that's a coincidence. I think it reflects perfectly his sensibilities. Philip is an extraordinarily devout Catholic. And that devotion can be seen in what you find inside the house. 7,500 relics, pieces of saints for the past 1,500 years he has collected and cherishes. Moreover, the center of the palace is a giant basilica, a giant church with a monastery. This house, this palace, El Escorial, then, is an important piece of primary source evidence that speaks to Philip's intense Catholicism. The 7,500 relics, the design, the massive basilica right in the middle of it. This is a man who is as Catholic can be. And because of this, he views England as the land of heresy. The Protestantism of England in general, and Elizabeth in particular, he views as it is his duty to destroy that Protestantism, to bring those heretics back to the true faith of Catholicism. And he can build a house like this size, this scope, because of this global empire. Because of the trade routes to the New World and the trade routes to the East, to India, to the Spice Islands. From the New World comes silver, tobacco, eventually coffee, and from the East comes spices, pepper, cinnamon, all extraordinarily valuable. Makes Philip a very, very wealthy man, the wealthiest man in the world. England, on the other hand, a bit of a backwater. It's very poor. And Elizabeth is jealous of Philip's wealth and power. And so she organizes and sponsors piracy. People like Sir Francis Drake, people like Sir Walter Raleigh, for whom Raleigh, North Carolina is named. And many, many others are sponsored by her and given the charge to go and steal Spanish stuff on the high seas. They call themselves privateers, which is a nice way to say pirate. Very successful. They become rich, and they cut Elizabeth in on the spoils of their piratical raids. Now, understandably, Philip is not pleased by this state-sponsored piracy. And this is the first of our ingredients that will lead to his decision in the 1580s to invade England. This is ingredient number one. But there's more. Because Philip has on his hands, in the 1570s, a revolt in one of his European territories. The House of Habsburg controls the Iberian Peninsula, controls large swath of what is today Germany, controls southern Italy, and what is today Belgium and the Netherlands. Now, the Protestant faith has taken hold in the Netherlands in a very meaningful way. The Dutch are even more Protestant than the English. Philip doesn't like this. He sees it as his mission to bring these people out of their heretical ways. And so, beginning in 1572, he demands that the Dutch reconvert to Catholicism. The Dutch refuse, and he has a rebellion on his hands. It soaks up more and more of his treasure as it drags on to the 1570s and the 1580s. Elizabeth supplies the Dutch rebels with money. She supplies the Dutch rebels with military aid. And in 1588, she recognizes the United Provinces of the Netherlands as an independent country. Diplomatic recognition. Philip is furious. During our own Civil War, the British flirted with the idea of recognizing the Confederacy as an independent country, because the British cotton mills, the textile mills, were entirely dependent on southern cotton. And there was a time when England seriously considered throwing its weight behind the Confederacy. Now, that didn't happen, but the analog of that does happen here in 1588. Elizabeth recognizes the Netherlands as an independent country, infuriating its, in his mind, rightful master, Philip from the House of Habsburg. And so we've got three ingredients that will lead Philip to construct this massive fleet, the Armada, with the goal of conquering England, wiping out the Protestant heresy there, fixing his Dutch problem, and also ensuring that the high seas are free from English privateers.
Witnessing the Pope in Rome, Philip declared a holy crusade against Protestant England. "I have dedicated this enterprise to God," he said. He called for the creation of a naval force on a scale the world had never seen. Shipbuilders all over Spain and Portugal worked for 2 years, constructing a total of 131 galleons, each weighing over 200 tons. When completed, the fleet stretched a staggering 2 miles until it filled the horizon. To lead the expedition, Philip chose Spain's foremost military tactician, the Duke of Medina Sidonia. It was a risky decision. Medina Sidonia had never before commanded at sea. Spain's greatest soldier tried to decline. He said, "I have no good health for the sea. I know by my little experience that I shall soon become seasick." But Medina Sidonia had greater virtues than experience, a noble name, a spotless reputation, and a piety equal to Philip's. On February the 9th, he took command of the Great Armada. With a small hand-picked staff, Sidonia immediately set to work. He planned his Armada fleet to be like a Catholic fortress at sea. This fleet was holier than most. Along with 600 pints of wine and 80 pounds of rice, several hundred priests of the Spanish Inquisition would sail with the Armada to convert the English one way or another. Sidonia made the sailors give up whoring, gambling, and for the most part swearing. The day the Armada sailed, every man in the fleet took communion, and the entire nation prayed.
In his palace outside Madrid, Philip had long prepared an invasion plan. It was ambitious, deploying 2 separate armies. The Armada would escort the fleets from Spain to the English Channel. There they would combine with troops from the Spanish Netherlands. Together they would land in Kent and march on London. Elizabeth knew of Philip's plans, but could offer little resistance. While he had 2 regular armies, she had none. Her part-time militiamen were no match for Spanish professionals. England's only defence was the sea and the ships of the Royal Navy. As the Armada entered the Channel on July the 29th, 1588, the English saw for the first time the scale of Philip's invasion force. Everything favoured the Spanish. They were in open sea with the wind behind them. At anchor in Plymouth, the English were a sitting target. Yet when Sir Francis Drake was warned of the threat, he is said famously to have shown more concern for his afternoon sport than for the approaching Spanish.
This was a dramatic moment. This was the Spanish fleet of 130-odd ships found in the western approaches just off the Lizard. Drake's response is one of cool, calculated, phlegmatic dismissal, that there is plenty of time to deal with this enemy and finish the game of bowls. Whether it's absolutely correct, we don't know, but it works. It's a piece of theatre that's gone into the Armada legend.
But why did Drake do nothing? Looking at the tide patterns for that July day, Steve Hall, an oceanographer, reckons he simply had no choice.
It's possible to predict quite accurately what the state of the tide and the current flow would be. And we can see that if Drake had been wanting to finish his game of bowls, there wasn't really anything he could do until 8:30, 9 o'clock in the evening anyway, because of the state of the tide. There was no way of getting those ships into the English Channel.
The English lay helpless. The Spanish made no attempt to strike. Their commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, had orders to keep strictly to Philip's battle plan.
18,000 Spaniards ashore in Plymouth would have been quite a headache for us. Fortunately, the Spanish orders were so inflexible that this golden opportunity that the Duke of Medina Sidonia might have taken advantage of was missed there for Spain.
An opportunity which the English seized as the tide turned.
micromanager. He famously didn't sleep very much. He'd stay awake at night, poring over the paperwork from the four corners of his empire. And he planned out every last step of this invasion. The Duke of Medina Sidonia did not have room to maneuver. He did not have the authority to deviate from Philip's plan. And while there is a golden opportunity here, the Royal Navy, such as it exists, is in port at Plymouth. He has 18,000 soldiers in his transports. He could have gone ashore at that point. Elizabeth has no army. There is no English army. She has some militiamen, citizen soldiers, who would have been wiped out by the professional Spanish military. But Medina Sidonia has no room to maneuver. He has strict orders that he is to proceed to Calais and take on board his ships another 15 or 16,000 soldiers that have been fighting the Dutch and the Spanish Netherlands. And together, they'll cross the Channel and invade England. That is the plan. It is not a matter of question that Medina Sidonia will carry it out as planned.
Upwind, the Spanish were still confident, but they were about to be confounded by the quickness of the English warships.
Because the English ships were capable of sailing much closer to the wind than the Spanish thought, to their horror, the Spanish found the English ships working their way behind them, ahead of them, around their fleet, and getting into tactically advantageous positions, surprised the Spanish.
The English had used the maneuverability of their ships to seize the advantage of wind and weather from the Spanish. Now they could dictate tactics.
The important thing about gaining the weather gauge or getting upwind of the enemy is it gives you total flexibility of maneuver. You can either attack or pull away as you will. Those who are downwind really have to react to what you're doing. They're not in a position to really do much about it. You can drop down from upwind on them. It's very hard for them to claw their way back up to get at you.
It was the Spanish who were vulnerable now, but they responded quickly. They switched into the defensive crescent formation used by their treasure fleets.
The Spaniards were very experienced at organising defensive convoys. They'd been doing it for a long time. And it was a good formation. The English could really only attack the trailing wings where the main Spanish warships were stationed. They couldn't safely penetrate into the gap between because it would have been too easy for them to be trapped by Spanish ships.
The Spanish expected that any fighting would be at close quarters. That was how sea battles had always been fought. But the English had a new kind of warfare in mind. They intended to sink the Spanish at long range.
Since the days of ancient Greece, and even before, for over 2,000 years, war at sea had consisted of sailing up right next to your opponent's ship, boarding their ship, and fighting hand-to-hand as if you were on land. In fact, just 17 years before the Armada sails, the last great battle like this happened in the Mediterranean, in a place called Lepanto. The combined Spanish and Venetian fleet of galleys, oared vessels, whose design goes all the way back again 2,000 years to ancient Greek triremes, fought the Ottoman Turkish fleet. And the way they fought was you row up next to the ship of your enemy, you throw over grappling hooks, you board the ship, and you fight hand-to-hand. That's how the Greeks had done it, the Phoenicians had done it, the Carthaginians had done it, how the Romans had done it, and it's how it's done in the Spanish playbook. The English, on the other hand, have a different type of warfare in mind. They are going to use some new high technology, artillery, in the form of the culverin cannon.
And this was the weapon the Spanish feared most. The long-barreled cannon, known as the culverin, or snake. To the English, it was a ship killer, but would it prove the decisive factor in sinking the Spanish?
Stand by. 5, 4, 1, fire!
The culverin's opening shot is well over a quarter of a mile. What those early gunners could not have dreamed of measuring was the speed of the cannonball leaving the muzzle. At over 400 meters a second, the 24-pound iron shot is travelling at above the speed of sound. Wooden galleons were surprisingly hardy, as the Elizabethan gunners soon found. It was one thing to hit the enemy, but to sink them needed repeated shots on target. Accurate and consistent fire at a time when most sailors had no knowledge of maths or science. Yet while the English were out shooting the Spaniards, they still had difficulty sinking them. Medina Sidonia's flagship was hit 200 times but kept sailing, and the English powder and shot were almost spent.
They were firing, in comparison with the Spaniards, much more quickly, much more effectively, and causing real damage to the Spanish ships. But it was relatively limited. They just didn't have the ammunition stocks to keep up the continuous attrition which is necessary to physically disable or sink a wooden ship.
Quite frankly, there was not enough firepower going down to stop the Armada. We could not put enough weight of fire into various vessels to slow them down. Otherwise, we would have expected far higher casualty rate.
400 years ago, the Elizabethan gunners had put their faith in heavy guns like the cavalry, but that hadn't been enough.
Every generation has its new super weapon. They all think it's going to work wonderfully. They've all done trials. But when it comes to the real war, somehow things are different. Well, it was the same with their new heavy guns. It didn't work as well as they thought it was going to, and they were a long way from having worked out the most effective ways to use smooth-bore, muzzle-loading guns.
The Spanish were battered but unbroken. The English in good order but desperate for ammunition. No glorious victory, just a standoff.
It was essentially a draw. Neither had achieved what it wanted to achieve. The Spaniards hadn't landed in England, but equally the English hadn't defeated the Spaniards. The Armada was still in good order, its discipline and formation was intact, and it was still a very formidable force. The Duke of Medina Sidonia was in charge.
The problem is, these culverin cannons are firing solid shot, not explosive shells. If one of these cannonballs hits you, it will certainly ruin your day, but it doesn't actually do that much damage at long range to these wooden ships. The San Martin, Medina Sidonia's flagship, it's hit 200 times. It's fine. Sure, there's some casualties, but the formation is unbroken. Not a single Spanish ship has been sunk, and the English are losing the battle here in the Channel. From the English point of view, things are going very, very poorly. They haven't sunk a single ship. They fire thousands and thousands and thousands of cannonballs. Nothing to show for it. Their new wonder weapon seemingly doesn't work.
But even after 6 days at sea, they too had made little impression on the enemy. And such heavy long-range shooting had used precious powder and shot.
Because one of the big questions is why the English fleet or the Royal Navy was so relatively ineffective. It had the advantage of the weather gauge, it had the advantage of the fast maneuverable ships, and it had the advantage of heavy artillery. It had to break off the attack because it was using up too much ammunition, and it had very little to show for itself.
It was round one to the Spanish, and with English hopes crumbling, the way was now open for the Armada to follow through with its long-planned invasion.
Just as planned, early on Saturday morning, August the 6th, Sidonia sighted the French coast. By By midday, the Armada had anchored at the port of Calais, but the port was empty. All that was waiting for Sidonia was a messenger. The Spanish army was still 2 weeks away.
Oops. This is the problem with Philip's plan. Without long-distance communications, you can't organize something on this scale. He gets there on August 6th. No army. They're 2 weeks away. You know, with long-distance communication, something like this today might be possible. It would still be very difficult. And with 16th century communications, where you have to send a person with the message to get the message through, it's impossible. And so the plan has gone off the rails. Now, of course, the English don't know this. All they know is this 131-ship fleet, we haven't sunk a single one of them, is now in port at Calais. It seems very, very bad from the English perspective.
Sidonia was now a sitting duck. Food was running low, and the ammunition was almost gone. "I am anchored here," he wrote, "with the enemy's fleet on my flank. They can cannonade me whenever they like, and I shall be unable to do much harm in return."
For 6 days, the Spaniards had run the gauntlet of English firepower in the Channel. Now they had no choice but to heave to in open sea. They were at anchor and vulnerable, and the weather was turning.
The Armada's luck was beginning to run out. They had had a good time coming up the Channel as far as wind was concerned, but as the day progressed, they came under the influence of low pressure to the northeast, and that produced northwest winds which got stronger all the time.
And it's now clear that it wasn't just the weather that was beginning to conspire against the Spanish.
It's a full moon, going to have some very strong tides with strong tidal flows, and the Spanish wouldn't really be able to get out, certainly not in formation. Coming up to the evening, you see it gets to 8:30, 9 o'clock, the tide changes. Strong tides, about 3 knots, and so these ships would have been pinned against the coast at the mercy of the wind and the tide and the English.
But again, the English don't know that things have gone off the rails. They are desperate at this point. Something has to be done to change the equation in their favor.
Aboard the English flagship, Lord Howard and Sir Francis Drake grew worried. They had no idea the Spanish army had not arrived. Now might be their last chance to stop the Great Armada. But how? After hours of heated debate, Drake came up with a daring solution. He leaned over the meeting table and pounded his fist in excitement. "Fire ships," he shouted. "We'll send in fire ships." Stripped of crews, but with cannons loaded and decks ablaze, the fire ship was the deadliest weapon of its day. Once the flames reached the guns, this floating bomb would explode, spreading fire a mile around. The Spanish called them hellburners. There was nothing Sidonia feared more. Fire ships could destroy an entire navy in one blow. At midnight on Sunday, August the 7th, Sidonia's war council was interrupted by shouts from the deck of the San Martin. 8 glowing vessels were drifting with the wind and current straight towards them. For the first time since the Armada left Spain, discipline broke down. Captains cut their anchor cables and fled. The fire ships had broken up the Spanish formation. Now, each ship could be picked off one by one.
This is the point at which the English started firing at very close range. And this is the point, it's clear when Spanish ships are beginning to suffer serious damage and heavy casualties.
At long range, the English guns had been ineffective. Now, at close quarters, they proved fearsome.
We are beginning to see, I think, enormous damage being inflicted on the Spanish ships. Their decks are being raked by round shot. Swathes of splinters are scything through them. Anything with soft tissue is being cut down and severely damaged. Rigging structures of the boat are being smashed. The Spanish factory are taking a terrible pounding at this stage, and the hammering is getting worse, getting more and more intense.
The fire ships do their job. Many of the Spanish captains cut their anchor cables, meaning they really can't effectively stop again. The formation, which was the strength of the Armada, breaks up. Individual ships scatter in all directions, and now the English can approach at close quarters to these individual ships, and firing these culverin cannons at close range really does start to have an effect. Many ships are sunk, but many more escape, and they sail north to round the British Isles with the goal of getting all the way back to the Iberian Peninsula. But they didn't take into account the Gulf Stream, which comes up from the Gulf of Mexico, and is the reason why England is much warmer than it should otherwise be. The Gulf Stream comes up, and many of these ships turn left too soon and are shipwrecked on the shores of Ireland, where they are butchered by the local population, ironically, also the Catholic population, but the language barrier and xenophobia take hold, and these Spaniards that are shipwrecked on the coast of Ireland are in for a rude welcome by the locals. And so the Armada fails. And there are three main reasons why the Armada fails. The first is on Philip's shoulders. This was simply far too complex of an operation for the time period. His micromanagement style did not serve him well here. His refusal to delegate authority to someone like the Duke of Medina Sidonia, who, if he did have flexibility, could have landed his 18,000 soldiers in Plymouth and effectively conquered England with them, I have no doubt. But that's not what happened. And Philip's OCD comes back to haunt him here in 1588. Second reason. The English ships are crewed by many of the veterans of the privateering voyages of people like Drake and Raleigh. They're very skilled sailors. The Spanish ships are full of soldiers and priests. And yes, there are of course sailors on the Spanish ships, but you have a lot of people on these ships who are not really a big help in this naval battle. The priests are there to combat the heresy of Protestantism in England, and the soldiers are there to obviously convince the population that the priests should be allowed to do their jobs. So that's reason number two. And then there's some luck on the English side. The Armada has good weather sailing up the English Channel from the 29th of July to the 6th of August when they weigh anchor at the port of Calais. But while there, the winds change and the tides hold them in place. And this tide pattern and the winds allow the fire ships to be released to drift into the Spanish formation and break it up. And then when they round the coast of Scotland and shipwreck on the coast of Ireland, the tides, the current, the Gulf Stream again is their enemy. A portrait was commissioned by Elizabeth to celebrate this achievement, known creatively as the Armada portrait. Over her right shoulder is the Armada. Over her left shoulder is the Armada destroyed. And significantly, she has her hand on a globe here. And her hand is actually resting over North America. Elizabeth had long wanted to get into the colonies game. She'd seen how rich Spain became because of its American colonies. She wanted a piece of that action. The Jamestown Company is founded 20 years later, and the rest is history. So take 3 minutes, and with the person sitting next to you, let's work on those dendrites. Review your notes. What do you have here for the Armada? What are the reasons for its launch? What are the reasons for its failure? What's that? Well, Habsburg is a family.
Oh, okay. So
It's like a two. So say the big royal families call themselves houses: House of Valois, House of Tudor, House of Habsburg. It's the name of the family. It's actually a family that ruled the Austro-Hungarian Empire until the end of World War I, and had become fairly inbred at that point. And many of them were hemophiliacs. Well, there's lots of works on some of the there's lots and lots of
yeah, it's Protestant stuff.
there you could have landed in any number of places in southern Spain to very ship. But his plan is
Yeah. It's Dutch. Yeah, it's Dutch. No, it's Dutch.
He's devastated. I didn't survive. We know it's devastating. Believe God was on his side. Mission. It was emotionally and Spain is still a superpower. Philip, I think from came on and that's a tough thing to see, especially when you're
She didn't have an army. The first thing you could do was just lay in your bags, and then you could go pick the second army.
Is there too much
yeah.
At that point, yeah, she was just not waiting and just sailed right back across and threw her way off.
Someone.
If she didn't have an army, you give 18,000 guys, you would have probably taken the whole country.
Well, eventually, dynasty will take over Austria. They never really need
everything was nearly against us.
Okay, so that is half of the story here. The English Protestants feel that God has chosen them. That in this moment, providence, divine providence, has smiled on England and has chosen Protestantism over Catholicism. An event 20 years later will cement that belief and fuel the increasingly virulent anti-Catholicism that you find in England right up through the 19th century. 15 years after the victory against the Armada, Elizabeth, after 45 years on the throne, dies. She has no children, she has no heirs. The Tudor dynasty dies with her. But she has relatives in Scotland. And one of her relatives, James Stuart, inherits the throne. Now, James was raised in an extremely Protestant environment. And down in England, the Puritans, the hardcore Protestants, see him as their champion. That he's going to come down here and he's going to finish the Reformation. Because these Puritans felt like there were still too many Catholic elements in Elizabeth's settlement, and they wanted to get rid of them. And they thought James was the man for the job. They also hoped that he would continue the war against European Catholicism, especially the war against the chief Catholic power, Spain. On both accounts, they'll be disappointed. In the first year of his reign, at Somerset House, he arranges a peace conference with Spain. Spain is also ready to end this war. They're stretched thin around the globe and would just as soon be done with this English matter that has dragged on for almost 20 years.
The peace conference and ensuing treaty at Somerset House were commemorated in this painting. Through them, James ended the 20-year war with Catholic Spain. It was an auspicious start for James, the international peacemaker, but the result, paradoxically, was trouble at home.
On the one hand, the Somerset House Treaty meant that the hotter Protestants were shocked to discover that England, now at peace with the leading Catholic power, would no longer be the champion of their fellow Protestants in Europe. And, on the other hand, the extremer Catholics were equally dismayed to find out that Spain had not extracted toleration for Catholics as a price of the peace. Abandoned abroad, such Catholics turned, in desperation, to self-help and direct action at home.
At the beginning of November 1605, James was shown a tip-off letter warning that the political establishment of England would receive a terrible blow in the Parliament he was due to open on the 5th of November. James immediately guessed that the wording of the letter pointed to an explosion. But in order to catch the plotters red-handed, it was decided not to search the vaults under the Parliament chamber until the night of the 4th.
At 11 p.m, the search party entered and found a man standing guard over a pile of firewood, 35 barrels of gunpowder, and with a fuse in his pocket. His name was Guy Fawkes. If the gunpowder had exploded as planned, it would have been the terrorist bombing to end all terrorist bombings, wiping out most of the British royal family and the entire English political establishment. The plot played an important part in the development of the Catholic myth in England. The reality was that English Catholicism was a beleaguered minority faith. But in the fevered imagination of the hotter sort of Protestants, it became instead the fifth column of a vast international politico-religious conspiracy, masterminded by the Pope in Rome and aiming not only at the conversion of England, but at the subversion of English Protestantism.
the gunpowder plot, as it becomes known, fuels English fears of Catholic conspiracies. The English believed that the Pope, the Catholic King of Spain, the Catholic King of France were all conspiring to destroy Protestantism in Europe in general and in England in particular. This will be the leitmotif of the entire 17th century. Myths and rumors, fears of a Catholic conspiracy. It'll rear its ugly head again in the 1680s when the King of England, an adult convert to Catholicism, is overthrown by his Protestant Parliament. Guy Fawkes is the poster child for this gunpowder plot, and every English school child learns the rhyme, remember, remember, the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgotten. Now, for a very long time, many historians said, well, there wasn't enough gunpowder to destroy the House of Parliament. And that was the generally accepted theory. But then recently in England, a group of scientists decided to put it to the test. They built a replica of Westminster Hall and put in the basement of it 35 barrels of gunpowder and set it off.
That was big.
It had some timber in its construction, but a lot of stone. Now, this had a stone foundation, a stone basement, and then they built the rest of it out of wood. And you might say, well, the stone building would have survived better. Actually, what the stone building would have done would have been to channel that blast up through its walls and killed, absolutely without any doubt, everyone inside. James would have died. His family with him would have died. The entire assembly of lords, bishops, the members of Parliament for the House of Commons, it would have completely wiped out the entire political establishment in England. And so these two events, one in Elizabeth's reign, one at the beginning of James's reign, cement in English minds that Catholicism is the enemy, that Protestantism is under siege from this Catholic enemy, and that will be the theme of the entire 17th century. It's not unlike the mentality in the United States during the second half of the 20th century in regards to communism, that there is an enemy, an ideological enemy, and that enemy is Catholicism. When we come back next time, we'll see how Protestantism in England fragments and shatters in the cauldron of the English Civil War between moderate Protestants and radical Puritans like Oliver Cromwell. So you've got a chapter from the textbook that will help to kind of put everything in its proper place. And there's two pieces of primary source evidence. One are ballads, the lyrics to ballads that were written and sung by royalists, by cavaliers, and then some excerpt from a book in the Old Testament that we'll talk about in class. So, we'll have an English Civil War next time.